know where to find me.
Who streets? Who streets?
In a world teeming with right-wing individuals and extremists with horrendous ideologies, there exists Jeff Hall, perhaps the most extreme and dangerous neo-Nazi in the entire USA. His beliefs would make even Hitler balk.
My brother had shown a different side to him. Not all of the time. It was on random occasions, not predictable.
And his behavior is more antisocial than your average recluse. But how does such a person spend their days, and what impact do their actions have on those around them? In this video, we glimpse Jeff Hall's twisted life, shedding light on his bizarre ideologies and the tragic consequences. Early life. Jeffrey Hall's life was filled with personal hardship and societal inconsistencies. Born to Joanne Patterson, Hall's path through fatherhood and family issues shaped his narrative into one of tremendous struggle and societal critique. His first marriage was to Letitia Neal, and they had 2 children, Joseph, who was born on 19 June 2000, and his sister, Shirley. The partnership, however, was far from ideal and eventually ended in divorce. Following their breakup, Neal began another relationship and gave birth to twins. In 2003, the twins were hospitalized owing to failure to thrive, resulting in a dire scenario. This sad tragedy prompted Child Protective Services to intervene and remove Hall's children from Neal's custody. Neal's living conditions were poor, with social workers noticing a lack of basic amenities, including power and gas, and larvae on dirty dishes. The children were discovered to be unclean, hungry, and covered in bruises. Hall was dealing with his troubles at the time, including being on probation for driving under the influence, which made it difficult for him to provide a stable home right away. In light of these conditions, the children were temporarily placed under the care of their grandmother. However, in 2004, Hall was able to win full custody of Joseph and Shirley, which must have felt like a success at an otherwise difficult time. Hall's personal life changed when he married Krista McCary, with whom he had 3 additional kids. This increased the total number of his children to 5. Despite the additions to his family, Hall's life remained turbulent. His ex-wife, Neal, had left California and remarried, only to return a month before the sad events that led to Hall's demise. Her return was motivated by a desire to recover custody of Joseph, adding to an already tense family dynamic. According to all accounts, Joseph Hall was a very disturbed child. His grandmother recalled him as temperamental and violent, traits that appeared to characterize his dealings with others. He'd been ejected from many schools for aggressive behavior, including one especially horrifying episode in which he attempted to choke a teacher with a phone cord. These behaviors demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of cause and effect, critical to navigating social interactions and personal accountability. In addition to his behavioral concerns, Joseph experienced substantial developmental challenges. He was diagnosed with ADHD and was found to have below-average IQ. These considerations likely exacerbated the difficulties he encountered throughout his educational path. His parents, under the supervision of River Springs Charter School, elected to teach him and his sisters at home, most likely in an attempt to handle his requirements in a more controlled setting. The family's history portrays a home dealing with internal and external challenges. Neo-Nazi. Hall struggled to find work for many years due to a substantial downturn in the construction business. His idea that Jews and non-whites were responsible for the declining labor market compounded the economic difficulties. This perception drove him to get more involved in extremist ideologies, eventually reaching the position of leadership within the neo-Nazi organization. In October 2009, Hall led a National Socialist Movement group to a rally near a day laborer site in Riverside, California. The National Socialist Movement is a neo-Nazi movement headquartered in the United States. It was previously a member of the Nationalist Front and was regarded as the country's largest and most important national socialist organization. However, the NSM's membership and influence have dropped substantially in recent years. The Southern Poverty Law Center identifies the NSM as a hate group, citing its radical and racist views. The NSM publicly announced its goal of uniting all white Americans and establishing an all-white country in the United States, modeled after South Africa's Volksstaat concept. Participants at the Riverside event wore Nazi uniforms from World War II, symbolizing their support for the Third Reich's ideals. In a November 2009 interview on the rallies in Riverside, Arizona, and Minnesota, Hall highlighted the thoughts motivating their movement. They're proud of who they are, tired of white guilt being imposed on their children and multiculturalism. They don't see any cause for it. Hall turned his extreme opinions into a political campaign in 2010. He stood for a seat on the Western Municipal Water District Board against an incumbent. Hall's open campaign as a white nationalist drew great attention and controversy. Despite his extreme agenda, he received almost one-third of the vote, indicating a troubling undercurrent of acceptance for his views among the community. Confrontation. In March 2011, Jeff Hall, a prominent figure in the white supremacist movement, led a group of about 24 followers on a march through Claremont, an affluent, primarily residential area in Los Angeles County known as the City of Trees, due to its picturesque surroundings and high level of education among its residents. The group, which included members with white nationalist ideas, went into Claremont with an objective that swiftly aroused widespread public outcry. The NSM assembled in the motel foyer with a strong sense of urgency and purpose. This was the planned march to Los Angeles City Hall as a protest against illegal immigration. The atmosphere was a dramatic contrast to the previous afternoon's easygoing companionship. Now the atmosphere was aggressive, fierce, and disciplined. The group's leader addressed the assembled members, asking them to show themselves with professionalism and resolve. Dressed in German Nazi uniforms, the members appeared to carry historical weight, their postures stiffer and their attitudes more determined. Jeff Hall, the West Coast unit leader, followed their approach with a clear directive: start nothing and finish everything. It was a clear appeal to prepare for any potential war. Under heavy police escort, the NSM contingent began their march. The streets leading to City Hall were roped off, and a 100-foot deep security perimeter was erected to handle the anticipated confrontation. As they approached their goal, the group confronted a vast mob of counter-protesters, who outnumbered them by at least 40-1. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and animosity. On the steps of City Hall, NSM members took turns speaking out against illegal immigration. Their discourse revolved around accusations that undocumented immigrants were living on welfare and snatching jobs from American citizens. The rage in their voices indicated deep-seated complaints and an evident scapegoating of immigrants for more significant economic problems. Amid the uproar, a few passers-by quietly expressed their support. Among them was a 45-year-old white male who encouraged the NSM members to keep up the good work, indicating a part of the population that related to their message despite the overwhelming resistance from the audience. The juxtaposition of furious protests and muted approval underlined the issue's polarization and the multiple layers of support and resistance within the community. The group's presence on Claremont streets was noticeable. Their march sparked a strong reaction from the local population, culminating in a clash with over 200 counter-protesters. These counter-protesters were either immigrants or activists who strongly condemned the white supremacists' rhetoric and presence. The tension between the two groups erupted into a loud and angry discussion in which both sides passionately expressed their opinions and objections. The immigrant rights activists, who outnumbered Hall's group, denounced the white nationalists as racist. They carried signs, yelled slogans, and used megaphones to raise their voices to protest Hall and his followers' views. The activists' message was clear. They condemned the white supremacist group's racism and bigotry and stood in solidarity with immigrant communities, which are frequently the victims of such abhorrent ideology. Hall defended his group's conduct during the confrontation by highlighting border patrols. He said that their first-hand experiences on the border gave them a thorough understanding of the issues at hand. We patrol the borders, we see the devastation, we see the drugs, and we know the reality, Hall said, explaining their presence and actions based on their assessment of the situation along the U.S.-Mexico border. The incident received significant law enforcement scrutiny. Dozens of police officers from several police agencies were dispatched to the site to keep order and prevent the situation from going any further. The police presence was strong, indicating that the authorities were aware of the possibility of violence and the necessity to maintain public safety during such a contested and emotionally charged encounter. Amid the public dispute and heightened tensions on Claremont streets, a reporter from the New York Times was offered an inside glimpse into Jeff Hall's personal and domestic life. To better grasp Hall's motivations and beliefs, the writer visited his house and interviewed him and other group members. This visit contrasted sharply with the chaotic and violent situation outside, providing a look into the private lives of people engaging in public rallies. During the interview, the reporter saw exchanges in Hall's home, including a talk with his 10-year-old son. The child proudly wore a leather belt with a silver Nazi SS insignia, a horrifying symbol of one of history's most infamous and vile regimes. His father had given him the belt, symbolizing the transmission of radical ideas from generation to generation. This event emphasized the profoundly rooted nature of these ideals inside Hall's family, as well as the troubling indoctrination of young children into hate-based worldviews. Demise. Jeff Hall proudly boasted about teaching his eldest kid, Joseph, how to use night vision and fire a rifle. Many would be shocked to hear such a comment from a father, but Jeff Hall took joy in it. He frequently displayed these lessons as a symbol of strength and preparation. Unfortunately, these teachings took a tragic and unexpected turn. On the 1st of May 2011, Hall's contact with his oldest kid, 10-year-old Joseph, exposed a darker side. When Joseph snatched 6 chocolate chip cookies, Hall pursued him, taking the cookies from his grasp in a brief battle that ended with Joseph's terrified escape. Hall's influence extended to his work in the NSM, where meetings frequently began with his criticisms of national policy and emphasis on the significance of NSM border patrols. These operations, which included his young son, were portrayed as efforts to defend our nation from the invasion of Mexico. Leadership in the NSM enabled Hall to direct his anger and disappointments toward a practical goal, blaming economic troubles on minorities and immigrants rather than systemic concerns. This perspective resonated with many struggling Americans, and it was bolstered by media characters such as Rush Limbaugh, who presented economic dislocation as the product of minority empowerment, rather than class differences. Hall's house served as the setting for a horrifying final image. Joseph, blond and blue-eyed, sat on the steps eating a sandwich, his toes peeping through 2 small shoes, close to an NSM member wearing black combat boots. Hall and a friend drove a fellow NSM member home to San Diego that evening. When Hall returned, he drank whiskey and fell asleep on the faded beige sofa. This simple scene signaled the end of an exceptional and ultimately terrible life. Joseph retrieved a revolver from a closet shelf. The boy, who had been taught how to handle firearms by his father, drew the hammer back, pointed the gun at his father's ear while he slept on the couch, and shot him. Consider how tough it must have been for such a young boy to decide to perform such an atrocity. Joseph later described to authorities the horrific events that led up to the fatal gunshot. The day before, his father had issued a scary threat. Jeff Hall had stated that he would remove all smoke alarms from their home and burn them down while the family was sleeping. Such a threat was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of harassment and intimidation that had grown over time. Joseph confessed that he was fed up with his father hitting him and his mother. His 26-year-old stepmother, Krista, confirmed Joseph's account, admitting that Hall had been abusive against both her and the children. Krista testified how Hall would sometimes lose entire control, kicking his son in the back and engaging in other abusive conduct. The police report described a residence in extreme disarray. The floor was piled with garments, the odor of urine permeated the air, and various weapons were within easy reach of the children. The residence was described as dirty, representing the turmoil and neglect that dominated their lives. Imagine living in an atmosphere where danger lurked around every corner and fear was your daily companion. It's almost unbearable to think of how depressed and hopeless the youngsters must have felt every day. Following the incident, Joseph was apprehended and transported to juvenile hall. His 4 siblings were taken in protective custody, which most likely caused a mix of relief and confusion for the youngsters who had been abruptly wrenched from their familiar but frightening home. Krista was arrested and charged with criminal firearm storage and child neglect. The legal consequences were serious, but they were required to confront the negligence and endangerment in the household. Joanne Patterson, Jeff's mother and Joseph's grandmother, was given interim custody of the remaining children. Joanne told news channels that she wasn't surprised by the unfortunate events, but she had anticipated it to happen when Joseph was older. Joanne believed Jeff's involvement with neo-Nazi ideas had accelerated the violent outcome. She also said Joseph had shown problematic conduct, such as lighting fires. Joanne's words offer a heartbreaking reflection on the family's situation. However, her expectation that something like this will happen later emphasizes the sense of inevitability felt by those close to the family. Joseph stated his motive for the shooting, citing an episode of Criminal Minds in which a youngster shoots his violent father and receives no punishment. This episode seems to have greatly impacted Joseph, prompting him to feel that he, too, could similarly address his troubles. It's heartbreaking to imagine a child finding solace or a solution to his issues in a television show, demonstrating how desperate and out of alternatives he must have felt. He had the naive notion that his father would survive the shooting, and they might reconcile later. This sad mistake shows the intricacies of abusive relationships, in which victims, particularly children, may continue to seek approval and reconciliation despite terrible mistreatment. The terrible tale of Joseph and Jeff Hall highlights a larger issue of marital violence and child abuse within families. Jeff Hall's violent behavior produced a toxic environment, which eventually led to his death. The house was described as filthy and chaotic, with neglect and abuse as part of the everyday routine. This example demonstrates the serious impact of domestic abuse on children and the lengths they will go to escape their situation. Isn't it horrible to think about the depths of anguish that may drive a child to such drastic measures? Trial. Joseph Hall's story is surprising and very disturbing. At the age of 10, Joseph was accused of taking his father's life, which raised serious concerns about juvenile justice, mental health, and the influence of an abusive environment. Despite his young age, the court system proceeded with the charges, and the consequences of his possible conviction were severe: confinement in a juvenile detention center until age 25. The defense for young Joseph initially considered pleading not guilty due to insanity. They claimed that Joseph had developmental difficulties and had been conditioned to violence by growing up in an abusive home. According to court papers, Joseph had below-average intellect and ADHD. His public attorney cited him as stating, "I figured if I shot him, he wouldn't be able to hurt us." This remark underscored the tragic reason for his actions: a desperate attempt to shield himself and his family from future violence. On the other hand, the prosecution presented a very different picture. They alleged that the murder was premeditated, claiming evidence that Joseph informed his sister of his plot to shoot their father days in advance. The prosecution also cited Joseph's history of aggressive behavior, which dates back to kindergarten when he stabbed a teacher with a pencil. The district attorney portrayed Joseph's father, Jeff Hall, as a loving father and said that his Nazi involvement had nothing to do with the crime. In 2013, the court convicted Joseph of the crime. The judge determined that the minor knew what he did was wrong and that there was planning and understanding in the commission of this crime. This verdict reinforced the court's opinion that, despite his age, Joseph acted with comprehension and intent. During the sentencing hearing, Joseph's lawyers provided evidence about his psychological well-being, hoping to reduce the sentence by emphasizing the child's mental health concerns and the terrible environment he lived in. Joseph was eventually sentenced to juvenile imprisonment until the age of 23. This sentence, while harsh, demonstrated the court's attempt to balance the gravity of the crime with Joseph's age and mental state. The legal process, however, did not finish there. In 2015, the California Supreme Court declined to hear Joseph's case, reaffirming a lower court's ruling that a 10-year-old could understand Miranda rights. This decision was crucial because it confirmed that even young children had the legal and cognitive ability to understand their rights while in police custody. The following year, the United States Supreme Court declined to consider the case, effectively ending the legal disputes. Joseph's case represents more significant concerns within the criminal justice system, particularly the treatment of juvenile offenders. The case sparked a heated debate about whether a boy as young as 10 could fully understand the ramifications of such violent conduct, as well as how much his environment and mental health should impact legal outcomes. The atmosphere in which Joseph grew up was far from ideal. His father, Jeff Hall, was a well-known white supremacist and regional director of the National Socialist Movement. This childhood subjected Joseph to a poisonous combination of radical ideals and familial abuse. According to the allegations, Jeff Hall was abusive not just to Joseph, but also to his other family members. This hostile and unpredictable atmosphere most certainly influenced Joseph's behavior and perception of violence as a solution. Joseph's tragic narrative highlights essential issues regarding the relationship between juvenile justice and mental health. How should the judicial system handle cases in which an abusive environment and psychological disorders substantially influence a child's conduct? Is jail the best solution, or should there be a stronger emphasis on rehabilitation and psychological support? Jeff Hall's views. Jeff Hall's legacy, as described in his own words, portrayed a man who considered himself and his organization, the National Socialist Movement, as defenders rather than aggressors. He insisted that their presence at the border was simply for observation and self-protection, not for engaging in violent acts. Hall stressed the use of legal firearms and pepper spray to defend against potential dangers, notably drug smugglers, who he saw as a threat to their safety. Hall, a parent, voiced deep worry for the protection of American children, mourning the loss of innocence caused by border-related crime and instability. He maintained that their acts were lawful, emphasizing making their presence known and reporting suspected activity to authorities rather than taking matters into their own hands. Hall's speech portrayed a vigilant but law-abiding organization driven by a duty to preserve American soil and its people. However, the aftermath of Jeff Hall's death revealed a different perspective. The NSM came under growing scrutiny and criticism for its role in promoting extremist views, particularly among young and naive people like Hall's son, Joseph. The incident highlighted the hazards of brainwashing and the possibility of violent outcomes, sparking thoughts about the organization's power and the broader ramifications of its ideology. For the Hall family, the aftermath was filled with great grief and instability. Jeff's widow, Krista, and their remaining children dealt with the emotional toll of losing a husband and father, which was exacerbated by Joseph's incarceration for his role in Jeff's death. The community around them struggled to cope with the tragedy, sparking debate about the intersection of personal and societal issues in cases of extremism and violence.